October 1216. Inside the damp, cold walls of Newark Castle, King John of England is dying. The air is thick with the scent of sweat fear, and something far worse, the literal smell of royal dignity, putrefying. This is not a king succumbing to a noble wound on the battlefield, or an assassin's blade in the dark. This is a rebellion, but the insurrection is happening inside his own bowels. Servants rush past with clean linens, a battle they cannot win against a foe that respects no crown. This is the monster from the Robin Hood legends, the ruler whose cruelty and greed became a dark fairy tale. This is the king who lost an empire in France, the tyrant so despised that his own barons turned their swords against him at Runnymede. They forced him at sword point to sign a document that would echo through the centuries and become the bedrock of law, the Magna Carta. He was a man defined by his ruthlessness, his cunning, and his absolute refusal to be controlled by anyone, be it baron, pope, or law. So how did it come to this? How did one of Europe's most feared monarchs end not in a blaze of glory, but drowning in his own filth? How did a king who commanded armies find himself conquered by an uncontrollable explosive flux that stripped him of all authority and left him utterly humiliated before the very court he had terrorized for years? The official story would whisper of poisoned pears or divine retribution, a simple end for a complex monster. But the truth, as always, is far less mystical and far more damning. The curse that brought King John to this pathetic end wasn't supernatural. It was man-made, a toxic cocktail of limitless greed, corrosive paranoia, and a political system he had personally shattered. As we are about to discover, his was an entirely avoidable death, the final pathetic symptom of a kingdom he had already poisoned from within. To comprehend the end of a king, you must first map the pathology of his kingdom. Not the kingdom of tidy maps and sealed charters, but the living, breathing, and frequently bleeding entity of the state. The reign of King John was not a simple political failure. It was a clinical study in how a single, malignant will can infect an entire nation. The catastrophe wasn't a sudden event. It was a creeping sickness, a slow-acting poison administered over years, whose symptoms escalated from a mild chronic ache into a full-blown convulsive fever that finally broke the patient. At first, the tremors were faint, almost imperceptible. In the early 13th century, the English monarchy, like any feudal state, operated on a complex and fragile machinery of obligation. Kings had what was diplomatically termed the royal prerogative, a set of rights that were vast but not infinite. Barons, in turn, had their feudal duties, a web of allegiances sealed with oaths of blood and faith. This was the kingdom's baseline state, its normal rhythm. The king required funds for war, and the barons provided it through scutage, or shield money, a clever transmutation of blood into coin. It was the accepted cost of order, a political transaction that maintained the delicate balance between the crown's power and the aristocracy's autonomy. Under John's father, Henry II, the system was a magnificent, terrifying clockwork of justice and power. It could be ruthless, but it was coherent. It functioned. The political atmosphere was stable, the water in the pot still cool to the touch. Then came John, and the temperature began to rise. He saw his father's intricate clockwork, not as an instrument of statecraft, but as a machine for minting money, and he was determined to run it until its gears glowed red hot. He didn't smash the rules, not initially. He was far too clever for that. Instead, he optimized them with the soulless precision of a loan shark reviewing a client's assets. He was a systems analyst of tyranny, an innovator in the dark art of extraction. The shield tax, once a tool for national defense, became John's personal subscription service. Levied 11 times in his 16-year reign, often for phantom wars that never materialized. It was a tax on peace, a fee for the privilege of not being at war with your own king. His true masterpiece, however, was the perversion of the law itself. The royal courts, which were meant to be the ultimate source of justice, became a public auction house. The court's traveling justices, once symbols of the king's reach, were transformed into a mobile fundraising unit. Records from the era read like a grotesque price list: a fee to have your case heard, a larger fee to have it expedited, and a truly ruinous sum to ensure the verdict was in your favor. Justice was no longer a right. It was a luxury commodity, and its price was whatever the king felt you could bear to pay. He found every vein in the kingdom's body and inserted a tap. He developed a particular taste for the vulnerable, turning the guardianship of widows and heiresses into a horrifyingly profitable enterprise. When a baron died, the future of his female kin fell into the king's hands. John saw not grieving women, but valuable assets to be liquidated. A noble widow seeking only to manage her late husband's estate would be presented with a bill for the right to remain unmarried. The alternative, forced marriage to one of John's landless, brutish cronies. For these women, peace of mind had a price, and John's collectors were always on time. The air in the kingdom was growing warmer now, thick with a silent, spreading resentment. It was a discomfort cloaked in the dry parchment of the law, a slow-burn injustice that was for now still technically legal. But the king's hunger for gold was soon eclipsed by a deeper, more corrosive appetite. A need for absolute control fed by a paranoia that bordered on madness. John, who had betrayed his own father and schemed against his brother Richard. The Lionheart lived in a hall of mirrors where every reflection held a dagger. He trusted no one, and so he decided that loyalty would not be earned but coerced. The heat began to simmer. The sickness was moving from the kingdom's treasury into its very soul. His preferred instrument was emotional torture. He began demanding the children of his most powerful nobles as hostages, forcing them to live at his court. These were not honored guests. They were living talismans of dread, gilded pawns in their father's political cage. Imagine the chilling silence in a baron's hall hundreds of miles away when news arrived from court. Was their son safe? Did their daughter still have the king's favor? A single misspoken word, a rumored alliance, could result in a hunting accident or a sudden fatal illness. The entire aristocracy was held in a state of suspended terror. This abstract horror was given a face, a name, and a legend of unbearable cruelty in the fate of Matilda de Braose. Her husband William was a powerful baron who fell from John's favor. When the king, following his grim protocol, demanded a son as a hostage, Matilda, in a moment of incandescent defiance, refused. She publicly declared she would not hand her child over to a king who had murdered his own nephew. It was the unspeakable truth finally given a voice. John's revenge was a calculated masterpiece of horror. He didn't just execute Matilda and her son, he chose a method so vile it would be whispered about for generations. He had them imprisoned in a castle dungeon, gave them a single sheaf of oats and a piece of raw bacon, and then had the door walled shut. Days later, the cell was opened to reveal a scene of ultimate despair. They were dead from starvation, and in her final madness, Matilda had gnawed the flesh from her own son's cheeks. This was not justice. This was not even retribution. It was a ritual of terror, an obscene piece of political theater designed to prove that there was no depth of depravity to which the king would not sink. He did not just kill them, he unmade them. After this, John was no longer seen as a hard king. He was a monster. The water in the pot was boiling. The final violent rupture was inevitable. In 1215, the barons of England, united by a shared sense of dread and financial ruin, finally cornered their monster. At a field called Runnymede, they forced John to sign the Magna Carta. It was a desperate attempt to chain the beast, to cage the king within the laws he had so gleefully dismantled. For one brief moment, it seemed the fever might break. But a man like John could not be caged. To him, an oath was merely a temporary inconvenience, a law, a suggestion to be ignored. In a breathtaking final act of contempt, he appealed to his ally, the Pope, who dutifully declared the Great Charter null and void. The ink was barely dry on the parchment of peace before John declared war on it. He unleashed a horde of foreign mercenaries, men with no loyalty to England, only to John's coin, and set them loose upon his own land. This was the ultimate betrayal. He was not a king defending his realm. He was a plague upon it. The mercenaries were not an army, but an infection, spreading fire and ruin from town to town. The king was no longer the head of the body politic. He was its most virulent disease. The kingdom was broken, convulsing in the throes of a civil war, born from one man's bottomless appetite for power. The nation was burning, and in his rage, John failed to notice that the flames were beginning to lick at his own throne, his own body preparing for the final ignominious act of a reign defined by poison. A kingdom at war with itself requires a king to match. In the autumn of 1216, King John became the living embodiment of the chaos he had unleashed. With his kingdom fractured, the rebel barons holding London and the French Prince Louis camped in the south, a lesser man might have negotiated. But John was never a lesser man. He was, for better or worse, an elemental force, and with his back against the wall, he chose not to govern, but to incinerate. The story of his end begins here, not in a quiet palace chamber, but in the fire and fury of one last desperate campaign, a final brutal tour of the inferno he had created. The campaign began with a deceptive, terrifying success. John, fueled by a bottomless well of rage, marched his army of foreign mercenaries north and east. This was not a war of liberation or a noble defense of the realm. It was a scorched earth tantrum on a national scale. He moved with a speed that baffled his enemies, a phantom of vengeance sweeping across the land. He wasn't trying to win hearts and minds. He was salting the earth of his own kingdom. Castles were taken, towns were sacked, and abbeys, even those supposedly under his divine protection, were plundered to pay his troops. The chroniclers of the time wrote with a sense of awe and horror, describing a king who seemed more like a biblical plague than a Christian monarch. He was a whirlwind of destructive energy, a man who had decided that if he could not rule England, he would leave nothing behind for his enemies to inherit. For a few brief weeks, it seemed the monster might actually win. His enemies were scattered and demoralized. His brutality had cowed the countryside into submission. In this maelstrom of his own making, John was at his most potent, his most terrifying, and his most alive. He was winning, and the victories inflated his already colossal ego to celestial proportions. He was not just a king. He was a storm, a force of nature, against which no mortal could stand. He had proven his enemies wrong. He had proven God was on his side. And it is at the very peak of this triumphant, blood-soaked arrogance that a man makes his most fatal mistake. The stage was set for a confrontation not with an army, but with geography itself. John found himself in Lincolnshire, needing to move his forces into Norfolk to cut off his enemies. Between him and his objective lay one of the most treacherous landscapes in all of England, a vast, menacing estuary of tidal mudflats, quicksand, and swirling sea mist known as the Wash. It was a place of eerie, desolate beauty, a shifting labyrinth of water and earth, where the land itself seemed to hold its breath. A wise commander listens to local knowledge. A prudent king respects the power of the tides. John, high on his own savage momentum and convinced the universe now bent to his will, was neither. The safe route was a long, circuitous march inland. But John was a man in a hurry, possessed by a frantic energy that bordered on madness. He chose the shortcut. He chose to defy the Wash. In an act of almost unbelievable recklessness, he decided to split his forces. He would take the longer, safer path with his soldiers. But his baggage train, the very soul and substance of his kingdom on the move, would take the direct route across the treacherous flats. Think for a moment what this meant. This was not just extra supplies and camp furniture. This train carried everything. It carried the royal treasury, the gold and silver to pay the mercenaries, who were the only reason he still had an army. It carried the state papers, the records of his reign. And most symbolically, it carried the crown jewels of England, including, legend says, the very crown of King Edward the Confessor. It was his wealth, his history, and his legitimacy all trundling along on a train of slow, heavy wagons, put at the mercy of the moon and the tide. Why, we can only speculate. Perhaps it was a calculated risk to gain a strategic advantage, or perhaps, and more likely, it was the ultimate act of hubris from a man who had begun to believe his own myth, a king who thought that even the ocean would not dare to defy him. The disaster when it came was not loud or violent. It was quiet, inexorable, and utterly humiliating. The heavily laden carts pulled by struggling horses moved too slowly. The local guides, if they were even listened to, misjudged the tide. Or perhaps the tide, in its ancient, implacable rhythm, simply came, as it always did. A strange fog rolled in, confusing the drivers. The ground beneath the wheels softened the mud sucking at the axles with a greedy liquid sigh. And then came the water. Not a great wave, but a swift, silent surge, the North Sea reclaiming its domain. John, having arrived safely on the far shore, could only watch in impotent fury as his kingdom dissolved into the gray water. There was no battle, no heroic last stand. Just the sight of carts overturning horses screaming as they were pulled under by the weight of the treasure they carried. The clink of gold and the gleam of jewels were silenced by the sucking mud. The great crown of England, the symbol of his divine right to rule, was swallowed by the indifferent, murky water. For any medieval king, this would have been a catastrophe. For John, a man whose entire identity was built on a fragile foundation of projected power and divine favor, it was a psychological annihilation. This was not a military defeat, it was a cosmic rebuke. It was a sign from a God he had long ignored, a judgment delivered not by fire and brimstone, but by cold, wet mud. The rage that had been simmering within him for months, for years, must have erupted into a volcanic, soul-shattering fury. The world had dared to prove him powerless. He stormed into the nearby Swineshead Abbey, not as a penitent king seeking solace, but as a cornered animal drenched penniless and radiating a palpable aura of menace. The terrified monks brought him food and drink, and it was here in the quiet solitude of the monastery that John's rage turned inward, becoming a final desperate act of self-destruction. The chroniclers tell us he gorged himself on a feast of peaches, or some say pears and new, freshly fermented cider. We can imagine the scene, a man trying to fill the howling void of his humiliation with anything he could find. He wasn't just eating, he was punishing himself, punishing the world, swallowing his rage and shame in a torrent of unripe fruit and potent drink. It was a gluttony born not of hunger, but of despair. The body, like a kingdom, can only take so much abuse. The combination of extreme psychological stress, physical exhaustion, and a reckless meal on a gut already ravaged by the unsanitary conditions of a military campaign was the final catalyst. The sickness began subtly, a traitorous cramp in his gut, a cold sweat on his brow. But it quickly escalated into a full-blown insurrection. The medical term is dysentery, but the reality was far more visceral. It was an uncontrollable violent flux, a biological treason that dethroned him more completely than any baron ever could. His final journey from Swineshead to the castle at Newark was a funeral procession for a man still living. The terrifying king, who had moved like lightning across the landscape, was now a pathetic, groaning wreck, being carried in a horse litter too weak to even sit upright. The fearsome army he had led now watched their commander reduced to a delirious, foul-smelling invalid. His authority evaporated with every agonizing mile. His orders, once capable of condemning men to be starved to death, were now the incoherent ramblings of a fevered mind. The man who had been obsessed with control had lost all control of the most fundamental territory of all his own body. He arrived at Newark Castle not as a conquering king, but as a piece of dying cargo. He lingered for a few days, his body and his reign dissolving in tandem. He died on the night of October 18, 1216, surrounded by the stench of sickness and failure. He had died not from a French sword, but from a microbe. Not from a grand conspiracy, but from a biological certainty. But what had truly killed him? Was it the peaches, the cider? Or was this final fatal illness just the inevitable physical manifestation of a much deeper poison? A poison of greed, paranoia, and cruelty that had been coursing through the veins of his kingdom for 16 years. To find the real killer, we must leave the sick room and enter the archive. The autopsy is about to begin. The body lies cooling in Newark Castle. The kingdom, for the first time in 16 years, holds its breath, not in fear, but in anticipation. The narrative of history is about to be written, and like any good story, it needs a simple cause, a clear villain, and a satisfying conclusion. But we are not here for simple stories. We are here for autopsies. The physical body may be beyond our reach, but the body of evidence is perfectly preserved. So let's dim the lights, pull on the gloves, and open the file. Case file: the death of King John. The official cause of death is pending, but the court of public opinion has already returned two compelling verdicts. Let the investigation begin. The first and most theatrical of these verdicts is assassination. The story goes like this: at Swineshead Abbey, a vengeful monk, disgusted by the king's blasphemy and the plunder of his monastery, decided to take matters into his own hands. He presented the king with a cup of poisoned ale, bravely taking the first sip himself to prove it was safe, knowing he would die alongside the tyrant. It's a fantastic story. It has a heroism, sacrifice, and a satisfying cinematic justice. A single monk, a single cup, and poof, a kingdom's problems are solved. It's neat, it's tidy, and it's almost certainly historical fan fiction. The other, more mundane theory was simple gluttony. John, a man of legendary excesses, simply ate himself to death. A surfeit of peaches and new cider, the chroniclers called it. This narrative is just as appealing in its own way. The greedy king, undone by his own insatiable appetite. It's a perfect moral fable, a cautionary tale about the sin of overindulgence. Both stories serve a crucial purpose. They make the king's death an event, an anomaly, caused by a single external factor, a dose of poison or a bowl of fruit. They isolate the moment of his death from the context of his life. But what if the cause of death wasn't an event at all? What if it was a process? What if the real killer isn't a person or a piece of fruit, but the 16 years of his reign? To find out, we need to look past the fables and examine the evidence. Let's begin with our primary eyewitness account, the words of the chronicler Roger of Wendover. He wasn't a fan of John's, but his clinical description of the king's final days is our most valuable piece of forensic evidence. Let's project the key passage. Wendover writes that after the feast, the king was seized with a violent pain in his stomach and attacked by a severe fever. But here is the crucial phrase. He says the king suffered from a dysenteric flux. In the 21st century, that phrase might sound quaint. In the 13th century, it was a terrifyingly specific diagnosis. A flux was not a simple stomach ache. It meant a severe, debilitating, and often bloody diarrheal disease. Wendover is not describing a man with indigestion. He's describing a man whose insides are liquefying, whose body is violently expelling itself from the inside out. This is a clinical portrait of a catastrophic enteric infection. The timeline further complicates the simple poison narrative. John's illness lasted for several days, a slow, agonizing decline from Swineshead to his deathbed at Newark. Most fast-acting poisons available in the 13th century, like arsenic or hemlock, would have killed him much more quickly, and with a different set of symptoms. A slow-acting poison is possible, but why bother when the symptoms so perfectly match a common and deadly disease of the era? The chronicles, intended perhaps to record a simple tale of treason or gluttony, accidentally gave us a perfect clinical description of the real culprit. They provided a medical chart documenting the systematic shutdown of a human body under assault from a microscopic enemy. Wendover thought he was writing a morality play, but he was actually filing the first forensic report. Our first exhibit tells us how John died, but to understand why, we need to zoom out from the deathbed and examine the environment that created the killer. Welcome to the modern lab. Let's put King John's final days under the microscope. The killer Wendover described has a modern name: dysentery and intestinal inflammation caused by bacteria like Shigella or Campylobacter. These are not exotic assassins. They are common thugs found in contaminated food and water across the globe, especially in environments with poor sanitation. Now consider the crime scene, a 13th century military campaign. It's not just an army, it's a mobile petri dish. You have thousands of men and animals living, eating, and relieving themselves in close quarters. Water is drawn from streams and wells that are almost certainly contaminated. Food is prepared in makeshift kitchens, often poorly cooked and stored without refrigeration. An army on the march is a paradise for pathogens, a five-star resort for deadly bacteria. It was not a question of if an outbreak of dysentery would occur, but when and who it would claim. But why John? Why the king? Surely he had access to better food and cleaner water than the average foot soldier. And here we must introduce a crucial accomplice in this crime stress. When the human body is under extreme prolonged stress, it floods itself with the hormone cortisol. Cortisol is useful in short bursts. It prepares you for fight or flight, but over time it systematically suppresses the immune system. It's like firing your own bodyguards right before an invasion. Now recall the events immediately preceding John's feast at the abbey. He had just witnessed the entirety of his royal treasury, the accumulated wealth of his kingdom, and the very symbols of his authority sink into the mud of the wash. Imagine the psychological shockwave. This was a man defined by his wealth and power, a king who believed himself to be God's anointed, watching his entire legacy be swallowed by a muddy tide. The level of pure cortisol-drenched rage and terror flooding his system would have been astronomical. His body's defenses, his immune system, would have been at an all-time low. Medically speaking, he was a sitting duck. He then arrived at Swineshead Abbey and consumed a meal of peaches and new cider. These were not in themselves poison, but they were the perfect delivery system and trigger. The peaches, likely unwashed, could have easily carried the fatal bacteria. The cider, being new, was in a state of active fermentation full of sugar and wild yeast. In a healthy gut, this might cause some discomfort. In John's severely stressed and compromised gut, it was like pouring gasoline on a spark. He had not only ingested the pathogen, he had provided it with the perfect warm, sugary, chaotic environment in which to multiply exponentially. The evidence is overwhelming. We have the motive, bacterial contamination, the opportunity, a medieval army camp, and a victim with a severely compromised immune system. This wasn't an assassination plot hatched by a heroic monk. It was a predictable, almost inevitable biological event. It was a crime of opportunity committed by a microbe. But if we stop there, we miss the most important part of the story. Because the bacteria may have been the weapon, but what loaded the gun. Our final exhibit is not a weapon or a body, but a ghost. A ghost written on parchment signed in a meadow at Runnymede a year earlier. This exhibit is the why. It is the psychological motive for this entire tragic end. To understand its role, you must ask a series of simple questions. Why was John on this frantic, desperate campaign in the first place? Why was he subjecting himself and his army to these brutal, unsanitary conditions? Why was he so stressed that his immune system collapsed? And why was he so full of rage that he resorted to a reckless, self-destructive meal? Every one of these questions leads back to a single answer: the Magna Carta. His categorical rejection of the charter, his refusal to accept that a king could be bound by the law, was what plunged the kingdom into the civil war he was fighting. This war is what put him on the campaign trail. This campaign created the perfect breeding ground for the bacteria that would infect him. This campaign led him to make the arrogant, reckless decision to cross the Wash. The disaster at the Wash produced the cataclysmic stress that crippled his body's ability to fight the infection. And the stress and humiliation are what drove him to the self-punishing feast that triggered the final, fatal stage of the illness. You can draw a straight, unbroken line of causation from the ink on that document to the flux in his bowels. The Magna Carta didn't poison his cup. It poisoned his entire world. It created the very circumstances that led directly to his biological collapse. The war it started was the disease of the kingdom, and John's dysentery was simply its final physical symptom in the body of the king. He had become a metaphor for his own reign, a body politic in a state of violent internal rebellion. So we return to our initial question: what truly killed King John? The peaches and cider were merely the trigger. The bacteria were the weapon. The stress from losing his treasure was the accomplice. But the ultimate cause, the true killer, was his entire 16-year reign. The curse was never supernatural. The cursed chamber was not the drafty room. in Newark Castle, but the entire corrupted system of unchecked power that he built around himself. The thesis of this investigation is now clear. The curse was John's own bottomless greed and corrosive paranoia amplified and made lethal by the system of absolute monarchy that gave him unlimited power to indulge those flaws. He had spent a lifetime treating his kingdom as a resource to be plundered, his people as subjects to be terrorized, and the law as a tool to be wielded and then discarded. He poisoned the trust between crown and country. In the end, his own body simply became the final broken casualty of a kingdom he had already sickened with his tyranny. The poison was not in the peaches. The poison was the rain itself. So we step out of the chamber, leaving the ghost of a failed king behind. The final verdict is in. King John was not felled by an assassin's poison or a divine thunderbolt. He was the victim of a mundane biological mugging, most likely dysentery, brought on by the catastrophic stress and filth of a war he started against his own people. His end was not tragic theater. It was a predictable, pathetic, and deeply biological conclusion to a disastrous reign. And yet, here lies the ultimate savage irony. In one final spectacular act of failure, King John's undignified death achieved what his entire life could not. It saved England. His demise immediately ended the Civil War. It placed his 9-year-old son, Henry III, on the throne, forcing a council of regents to govern. Desperate to win back the rebellious barons, their first act was to reissue the Magna Carta, embedding it into English law. By dying so inconveniently, John became the unintentional martyr for the very cause he sought to destroy. His death was the Magna Carta's greatest and most effective public relations campaign. It is a humbling reminder that the grand sweep of history often turns on the most intimate, undignified of details. The king who believed himself above all earthly laws was ultimately defeated by a law no one can ignore: biology. It proves that no matter how high the throne or how absolute the power, the bowels are always sovereign. As we've seen time and again in these chambers, history is a logbook of plausible mistakes made with perfect confidence. What's your verdict? Was John's death a fitting end or a lucky break for England? Comment below and subscribe to unlock more cursed chambers.